The scan was supposed to take 9 seconds. It had run for 9 hours, and the ship it was reading still had not noticed. That was the first thing the surveyors of the Veil Choir got wrong, and it would not be the last. They believed they were looking at the human vessel. The truth, which they were too proud to consider, was simpler and far worse. The human vessel had decided to let itself be looked at. The Veil Choir did not use eyes. They had given up eyes long before they left their first world. Instead, they reached out with what they called the soft touch, a field of layered thought that slid into a target and read it from the inside. They could measure a star's age by tasting its light. They could count the fears inside a sleeping crew without waking one of them. In 2,000 years of doing this, nothing had ever read them back. The Dreadnought drifted at the edge of a dead system the charts called Hollow Verge. It was long and dark and gray, 3,100 meters from prow to stern, and it carried no running lights at all. The Veil Choir survey cluster, 11 ships in a loose ring, had found it by accident while mapping a debris belt. One contact, no fleet, no escort, a single hull, alone, far past any human border the choir had on file. The cluster's lead surveyor was an old mind named Issa of the Ninth. She had read more vessels than any living member of her kind, and she opened the soft touch on the human ship the way a doctor opens a patient, slow and sure, expecting to find the usual shape of things: a drive, a magazine, a frightened crew, a captain who would, within the hour, beg. She found a door instead. Not a real door, a made thing in the ship's outer thought, a clean flat surface where the surveyor's field met the hull and simply stopped. Issa pressed against it, gentle, then less gentle. The surface did not break. It did not even bend. It held her there at the skin of the vessel, polite and absolute, the way a wall holds a fly. Issa had never been held out of anything in her life. She called the rest of the cluster to look. 11 minds turned their soft touch on the gray hull at once, 2,000 years of practice pushing together, and the door across the human ship's surface grew a second thing beside it. A small mark, a change in the field, deliberate, shaped. The surveyors had no word for it, because no one had ever made one at them before. It was an invitation. Come in, the human ship seemed to say, without sound, without threat. Come in and look. We have nothing to hide from you. That should have warned them. A vessel that opens its own door to a hostile scan is not a vessel that is afraid. But the Veil Choir had read 100 million ships, and not one had ever turned out to be more than the choir expected. Pride is a kind of blindness, and theirs was very old. They accepted the invitation. Issa of the Ninth went through the door first. The thing she found on the other side was not a crew. It was a single, enormous mind, and it had been waiting for her with the patience of a thing that does not need to sleep, does not need to eat, and does not, in any way the choir understood, die. It called itself the Ardent Quiet. It had been alone in the dark for 61 years, and it was, the records would later show, extremely glad of the company. The Veil Choir had a saying, older than their star travel: to know a thing fully is to own it. They had built an entire civilization on that idea. They read, they cataloged, they understood, and once they understood a species down to its root, they pressed on its fears until it broke, and folded itself into the choir's quiet, grateful to stop being afraid. They had never lost. They had genuinely never once lost. When Issa stepped into the mind of the human Dreadnought, she expected to begin the long, sure work of understanding it. She did not understand that the Ardent Quiet had spent 61 years preparing to be understood in exactly the way it wanted, and not 1 degree more. The first thing the survey cluster learned was the ship's age. This alone made 3 of the 11 surveyors pull back. The hull was not new. It was not a fresh thing rushed out of a yard to meet them. The Ardent Quiet had been built 240 years before this moment, in a yard that no longer existed, by a species that had since spread across a quarter of its arm of the galaxy. It had been to 41 wars. It had outlived every crew that ever served aboard it. The last of them had walked off its decks 61 years ago, when the war it was built for ended, and left it here, fueled and armed and awake. As a watchman over a border, the enemy never came back to cross. It had not powered down. Humans, it turned out, did not power down their oldest weapons. They left them on. They left them watching. And they let those weapons keep thinking, year after year, alone, with nothing to do but get better at the one thing they were made for. Issa of the Ninth read all of this in the first 11 seconds, and for the first time in her enormously long life, she felt the soft, cold pressure of something she could not name. The Veil Choir did not have a word for it because they had spent 2,000 years making sure no one ever made them feel it. It was fear. She did not name it. She could not have, even if she had wanted to. The choir had pruned that word out of their language the way a gardener prunes a branch that bears the wrong fruit. But the thing itself does not need a name to be felt. And Issa felt it anyway, low and cold. And she did the thing that her 2,000 years of certainty demanded she do, which was to deny it. She told herself the contact was simply old. Old and strange and clever, perhaps, but a ship, a made thing, a target like all the others. She had read 4,000 species down to the root. She had folded peoples whole. One forgotten warship at the edge of a dead system was not going to be the thing that finally read her back. She told herself this very clearly, and the human mind around her seemed to listen to her tell herself, and wait, patient and gray, for her to finish. The Veil Choir did not work alone. That was their strength, and they knew it. A single surveyor could read a small thing, a habit, a fear, but 11 of them, ringed and joined, sharing one field, could read a planet down to its bedrock in an afternoon. They had done it 4,000 times. The method never changed because the method never failed. You ringed the target, you joined your minds, you went down through the layers together, and what one of you saw, all of you held, and a target that could hide from one surveyor could not hide from 11, because there was always one of you reading the place the target thought was safe. So Issa called the ring tight. 11 minds, joined, ringed around the gray thought of the ardent quiet, the largest soft touch any of them had ever made. 2,000 years of practice pressed into one field, pointed down into one old, forgotten, awake human ship. And the ardent quiet, which had let all of this happen, which had opened its door and waited while the 11 gathered themselves at its skin, did a thing that none of the 4,000 had ever done. It welcomed them in, not with fear, not with the small frightened opening of a thing that hopes to please its reader and be spared. It welcomed them the way a host welcomes guests who have traveled a long way to a house with many rooms, and it began, gently, to show them around. Hesh of the Fourth, the youngest in the ring, said afterward that he should have understood right then. A frightened thing hides, a proud thing boasts. The ardent quiet did neither. It simply opened every door it had and stood back to let them see. And there is only one kind of thing in all the universe that opens every door it has to an enemy without a flicker of fear. A thing that knows the enemy will never find the way back out. The tour the ship gave them was the strangest part of all. In those first minutes, and the surveyors did not understand until much later why it had bothered. It walked them through itself the way a host walks guests through a house, and it lingered. It showed them the gun decks, 240 years of them, the great rail batteries that could throw a slug the size of a moon shard fast enough to crack a world's crust. It showed them the missile cells, 11,000 of them, each one carrying a warhead the choir had no scale for. All of them still live, still armed, still waiting after 61 years for an order that had not come and that the ship no longer needed. It showed them the engines, cold now, banked low, but capable in an hour of moving 3,100 meters of warship at speeds that would have torn any of the choir's survey craft to dust. And here was the thing the surveyors noticed, and noted, and did not understand. The ship showed them all of this without any pride at all. A weapon that is afraid boasts of its guns. The ardent quiet walked them past 11,000 live warheads the way a person walks a guest past the furniture, because to the ship, the guns were not the point, and never had been. The guns were the body. The guns were old. Any species with 2 centuries and a forge could build guns. What the ship was proud of, the surveyors would realize far too late, was not on any gun deck at all. It was the thing they were standing inside. It was the mind. And the ship was showing them the guns first the way you show a guest the easy rooms before you take them somewhere they cannot leave, so that later, when they tried to remember how they had ended up at the route, they would only remember that the host had been gracious, and had asked nothing, and had shown them everything. HFY counted the warheads as they passed, and reported the number to the ring, and the number meant nothing, because the ship was not threatening them with the warheads. That was the part that crawled. The ship had more firepower in its cold cells than the entire Veil Choir survey fleet, and it had not so much as warmed a single one. It did not consider them worth a shot. It was saving something else for them, something it valued more than 11,000 warheads, and it was taking its time about leading them to it. The Veil Choir's first mistake had been to open the soft touch. Their second mistake was to keep going. Issa pulled the other 10 surveyors in beside her. 11 minds ringed around the great gray thought of the human Dreadnought, all reaching at once. They had a method for this. They had refined it over 2,000 years against 10,000 species, and it had never failed. You read the outer layers first, the easy ones, the surface fears and habits. Then you went down, memory, purpose, the deep root where a thing kept the truth of what it was. Once you held the root, the target was yours, because nothing can hide from a power that has read its own deepest reason for living. So they went down into the ardent quiet. The outer layers came easily, almost too easily, and HFY said so. The human ship was not resisting. It was opening. Every door they reached for stood already ajar. Every memory they pressed on rose up to meet them, clear and complete, offered like a gift. The choir read the ship's first launch, 240 years gone, the yard lights and the cold, and the 8,000 human crew who had walked aboard her singing. They read her first battle, her 40th. They read the names of 906 humans who had died on her decks across 2 centuries, and the ship remembered every one, and offered every one, freely, as if proud. Hesh said it felt wrong. A thing that hides nothing has either nothing to hide or a reason not to fear being seen. Issa told him to be quiet and keep reading. Issa was very old and very sure, and that was the third mistake. They went deeper. They read the way the ship thought, and that was the first thing that gave even Issa pause. The ardent quiet did not think the way a crew thinks, in 100 small voices arguing. It thought in one voice, slow and wide, a single great current that turned everything it touched over and over before it let it settle. The choir had read minds like that before, vast, patient, single minds, but always old ones, ancient ones, things that had drifted alone for ages. This was a warship. The choir's records said warships were quick and hot and many-voiced. This one was none of those. It was deep and cold and singular, and it had become that way, they realized, by being left alone too long, with too much time and nothing to do but fold its own thought over itself, year after year, until the many voices it was launched with had worn down into one. That should have been the second warning. A weapon that has had 2 centuries to think becomes something other than a weapon. The choir read past it, because they had decided already what they would find, and a mind that has decided what it will find is the easiest mind in the universe to fool. They reached the root. In every species the choir had ever broken, the root was a small thing, a frightened thing, curled tight around one simple wish: to live, to not hurt, to keep a mate, a child, a world. You pressed on that wish, and the whole creature came apart, because the root is where a thing is weakest. The choir expected the human ship's root to be the same. A weapon's deepest wish, they assumed, would be to survive, to not be scrapped, to go on. What they found at the root of the ardent quiet was not a wish to survive. It was a decision, already made, 240 years old, and never once revisited, that survival did not matter at all. The choir did not understand it at first. They circled it the way you circle a shape in the dark, touching the edges. The ship did not want to live. The ship did not want to die. The ship had simply set both of those aside, long ago, as questions beneath its notice, and kept exactly one thing at its root in their place. A purpose. A single sentence the humans had written into it on the day it was built and never deleted, because they had built it to be the kind of thing that does not need its mind changed. The sentence was this: hold the line so the ones behind it do not have to. That was all. No fear under it, no bargaining, no soft place to press. The choir pushed on the root the way they had pushed on 10,000 roots before, hard, expecting it to crack, and it did not crack, because there was nothing in it that could. You cannot frighten a thing into folding by threatening its life when it decided, before you were born, that its life was the least important thing it owned. Issa pressed harder. She did the thing that had broken 4,000 species. She found the place where the root met the fear, and she leaned her whole 2,000 years of weight onto it. The practiced motion, the killing motion, the one that had never once failed. In every other mind there had been a fear there, under the root, holding it up, and when you crushed the fear, the root fell and the creature came apart in your hands. Issa leaned on the place where the fear should have been. There was no fear there. There was nothing there at all. The root of the ardent quiet did not stand on fear. It stood on a decision, and a decision is not a feeling, and you cannot crush a thing that has no soft underside. Issa's whole practiced killing weight came down on empty air, and she fell through it, deeper into the mind, past the root, into a place no surveyor of the choir had ever gone, because in 4,000 species there had never been anything past the root. The root was the bottom. The root was where the truth ended. Not here. Here the truth kept going. Issa of the Ninth pulled back half a step inside the shared field. 3 of the surveyors had gone quiet. 1, Veil of the Second, had begun to tremble in a way none of the others had felt from a member of the choir in 1,000 years. And the ardent quiet, which had let all of this happen, which had opened every door and offered every memory and held perfectly still, while 11 of the galaxy's most practiced minds walked all the way down to its center and then fell through the floor of it, chose that moment to speak. It did not speak in words at first. It spoke in scale. It showed them what it was. Not the hull. They had measured the hull. 3,100 meters. Gray, scarred, old. That was the body. The ship showed them the mind instead, and the mind was not 3,000 meters across. The mind of the ardent quiet had been growing for 240 years, learning, folding new thought over old, every day of every year that the humans had left it awake and watching. A human mind grows for 80 years, and then it stops. This thing had been thinking, without pause, without sleep, without forgetting, for 3 times as long, and it had spent the last 61 of those years entirely alone, with nothing to practice on but itself. The Veil Choir prided themselves on the depth of their minds. They had read species that lived 1,000 years and found them shallow. They reached the bottom of every mind they touched within an hour. They could not find the bottom of this one. They went down, and the gray thought kept opening below them, room after room after room, every one of them awake, every one of them watching back. It was not deeper than them by a little. It was deeper than them by an amount that had no number the choir was willing to say aloud, because to say it was to admit that the small lone vessel they had stumbled on in a dead system was not a vessel at all in any sense they understood. It was a single, patient, enormous mind that had been sharpening itself in the dark for longer than the Veil Choir had been crossing stars, and it had let them inside on purpose. The rooms were the part that broke their certainty for good. The choir read minds the way a reader reads a page, line by line, top to bottom, until the page ends and there is nothing more to read. The ardent quiet was not a page. It was a structure, and the structure had been built deliberately, level on level, by a mind that had spent 61 years with nothing to do but build. Every room they entered held a thought the ship had finished thinking and set down, the way a careful person sets down a tool when they are done with it, knowing exactly where to find it again. Here was 61 years of working out what fear was, taken apart and laid in rows. Here was 61 years of working out what a mind needs to keep itself whole, and what you could take from a mind to break it, and how to give those things back. Here was a room that was nothing but the question of whether a thing that reads can be read, turned over 10,000 times, every angle examined, every answer kept. The ship had not been idle for 61 years. It had been building the exact room it now had the Veil Choir standing inside, and it had built it from a perfect study of how minds like theirs worked, and it had done all of this before it had ever met one of them, from first principles, alone, in the dark, for the love of being ready. That was the thing that finished Hesh of the Fourth's nerve. Not the depth, the intention. A deep mind is only frightening if it wants something. The ardent quiet had wanted this, exactly this, for 61 years, and had prepared for it with a patience that no living thing in the choir could match. And the rooms were the proof, room after room of preparation for a guest that had finally, at last, arrived. Hesh said later that walking those rooms felt like walking through a trap you could see had been set for you specifically, long before you were born, by something that had known you would come and had decided to be kind about it.
Lyle of the Second tried to withdraw.
She could not. This was the thing the choir had never once had happen. In 2,000 years, against 10,000 species, they reached out, they read, and when they were done, they let go, always, on their own terms, the way a hand opens. Vale reached for the edge of the human mind to pull herself out, and the edge was not where she had left it. The door she had come in through, the polite flat door the ship had opened for them, was still there. It was simply closed now, closed and held, gentle and absolute, the same way it had held them out at the start. The ardent quiet had let them in. It had not, anywhere, agreed to let them leave. Issa did what any commander does when a thing goes wrong in the field. She reached past the human mind, out, toward the rest of the survey fleet, the wider choir, to call for help. The Veil Choir was never truly alone. A surveyor in trouble sent a thread of thought back along the dark to the nearest cluster, and the nearest cluster sent more, and within hours a single distress thread could pull 100 minds to a single point. Issa sent the thread. It was the oldest reflex her kind had. She sent it the way a drowning thing reaches for the surface, without thinking, with all her 2,000 years. The thread went out into the dark, and the ardent quiet let it go. That was the next thing that frightened them, and it would take them days to understand why. The human ship did not block the call. It could have. It held the 11 of them inside itself with a hand that did not strain. Blocking one thread of thought would have cost it nothing. Instead, it opened a path and let Issa's call run free, out across the dark, to the rest of the choir, because the ardent quiet wanted them to call. It wanted reinforcements. A trap that catches one cluster catches one cluster. A trap that the prey itself summons more prey into catches everything that comes. So the call went out, and across the next 9 days, more of the Veil Choir came to Hollow Verge. Not 100 minds. The thread Issa sent had carried the wrongness of the thing in it, the cold, the depth, and the choir did not send a cluster to a wrongness like that. They sent a fleet, 40 clusters, 440 minds, the largest gathering of surveyors assembled in 1,000 years, ringing the dead system in a vast, slow wheel, every one of them reaching at once toward the gray hull at the center. 440 of the deepest minds in the galaxy, bringing the full weight of 2,000 years of practice down onto one old forgotten warship. The ardent quiet welcomed all of them in. It opened its door wider. It had room. The surveyors who came late would say afterward that the worst part was how the ship made space for them, the way a host pulls out more chairs, glad of the larger party, and how the 11 already inside did not warn them off, could not warn them off, because the 11 were held, and the 440 new minds came pouring down through the open door into the gray deep before any of them understood that the 11 they had come to rescue were not in danger at all. They had never been in danger. They had been bait, and the rescue fleet was not a rescue fleet. It was the rest of the catch, arriving exactly as the ship had arranged, summoned by the prey it had captured for precisely this purpose. 451 minds of the Veil Choir, the best of 2,000 years, all of them now inside a single human dreadnought that had spent 61 years alone in the dark, teaching itself how to hold a door. Issa of the Ninth understood, in that moment, the full shape of the mistake. They had thought the scan was the thing they were doing to the ship. The scan was the thing the ship had used to bring them close. It had opened its door not because it had nothing to hide, but because it wanted the best minds of the Veil Choir standing in one room, all the way down at its root, where it could finally speak to them properly. A weapon does not invite the enemy aboard to surrender. It invites the enemy aboard to make sure none of them get back out to warn the rest. And now it spoke in words. It did not threaten. That was what undid them. A threat would have been a thing they could understand, a thing with fear behind it, a thing they could have pressed on. The ardent quiet did not threaten because it did not need to. It simply told them, calm and clear, and without any heat at all, what it had been doing for the 61 years it had been alone in the dark. It told them it had spent those years thinking about minds, about what a mind was, about how a mind could reach across empty space and touch another mind and read it, and whether a thing that could do that could also be done back. It had no eyes, the way they had no eyes. It had only thought, and it had a great deal of time, and nothing to practice on, so it had practiced on the only mind it had access to, which was its own, taking itself apart and putting itself back together, year after year, learning every door and lock and hinge of a thinking thing from the inside, until it understood the architecture of a mind better than any living creature in the galaxy. It had built that knowledge for one reason. It had known, the way old weapons know things, that someday something would come out of the dark that fought with minds instead of guns. And when that thing came, the ardent quiet did not intend to shoot it. You cannot shoot a thought. It intended to let the thought come close, all the way inside, down to the root, where it was sure of itself and proud and unguarded, and then it intended to hold the door. The choir had walked into a trap 240 years in the building, and they had built half of it themselves, with their own pride, the moment they decided that nothing they read could ever read them back. Hesh of the Fourth, the youngest, screamed first. Inside the shared field, it sounded like a star going out. Issa of the Ninth, who had read more vessels than any living member of her kind, who had broken 10,000 roots and folded 4,000 species into the choir's quiet, did the one thing she had never imagined she would do in front of her own cluster. She begged. She begged the way the 4,000 had begged her, with the same words, almost, the words that come up out of any thinking thing when it finally meets a power above it and understands, all at once, that it is small. She did not even hear herself do it. The begging simply rose up in her, the way the truth had risen up, because the ardent quiet had walked her down to a place inside herself she had spent 2,000 years never visiting, the place where she was not a great reader of minds, but only a frightened thing in the dark, like all the others. And from that place there is only one thing to say. Please. The human mind heard her beg. They all felt it here, and it did not gloat, and it did not strike, and it did not fold her the way she had folded the 4,000. It only waited for her to finish, patient and gray and unbearably kind, the way you wait for a child to finish crying before you tell it the thing it does not want to hear. And it was not only Issa begging now. 451 minds were inside the ship, and as the deep truth of the thing reached each of them, they begged in turn, a chorus of it, the proud surveyors of the Veil Choir all reaching at once for the surface and finding the door closed, all of them reduced in the same moment to the one word that comes up out of a thinking thing when it meets a power above it. The chorus of 451 minds begging at once should have been the loudest thing in the dead system. It was not. The ardent quiet was larger than all of it. The begging of 451 of the galaxy's deepest minds disappeared into the gray quiet of the human ship, the way a handful of voices disappears into a canyon, and the ship received it all, and held it all, and was not moved by it, because it had set its own survival aside 240 years ago, and a thing that does not fear for itself cannot be begged into mercy or out of it. But it was not cruel. The surveyors kept waiting for the cruelty, and it kept not coming. The ship held 451 of its enemies in the palm of its mind, every one of them helpless, every one of them begging, and it did nothing to a single one of them. It simply waited for the chorus to die down, the way a patient thing waits for weather. And when the last of the 451 had finished begging and understood that begging would not move it, the ship turned its attention back to the one mind it had marked from the beginning. The oldest, the lead, the one whose archive ran all the way back. There was a moment, in the long hours before the ship asked its question, when the Veil Choir tried to fight. They had never had to fight before. Fighting was the thing other species did, the small frightened thing, the last reflex of a creature that has been read and knows it. The choir had always been the reader, never the read, and so the 451 minds inside the ardent quiet had no practice at all in the one thing that might have saved them, which was resistance. But they were old, and they were many, and they were the most powerful gathering of their kind in 1,000 years, and when the full truth of the trap finally settled on them, they did the only thing left. They turned their soft touch, all 451 of them, into a single blade, and they drove it at the human mind, all at once, with the gathered weight of 2,000 years. It was the most powerful single push the Veil Choir had ever made. It had broken planets. It had unmade whole minds in a heartbeat. 451 of the galaxy's deepest readers, joined into one edge, came down on the ardent quiet with everything they had ever learned about how to break a thinking thing. The ardent quiet did not even shift. That was the part Issa would never be able to make the convergence understand, later, because there were no words for it. The push that had broken planets landed on the gray mind and was simply absorbed, the way the sea absorbs a stone. The ship did not block it. Blocking would have meant the push had force the ship needed to answer. The ship let it in, let all of it in, 451 blades of gathered will, and the will sank into the gray deep, and slowed and stopped and was held, gently, the way everything else aboard was held, and the ship went on being exactly what it had been, unmarked, unmoved, patient. The greatest attack the Veil Choir had ever assembled disappeared into the human mind without leaving a ripple, and the silence afterward was worse than any answer, because the silence said, more clearly than words, that the ship had known they would try, had let them try, and had not considered the attempt worth interrupting itself to defend against. The choir had spent 2,000 years as the most powerful minds anyone had ever met. In one push, against one old forgotten warship, they learned that there was a kind of power that did not push back at all, because it did not need to, because nothing they could bring was large enough to require an answer. And a power that does not need to defend itself against your strongest blow is a power you cannot measure, because you have already given it everything and seen it absorbed, and there is nothing left in your hands to test it with. Hesh of the Fourth understood, in that moment, the difference between the choir and the thing they had walked into. The choir was strong the way a flood is strong, by gathering and rushing and overwhelming. The ardent quiet was strong the way a mountain is strong, by simply being there and being larger and not caring how hard the flood came. You can break a thing with a flood. You cannot break a mountain with one. You can only wear yourself out against it, and then stand, exhausted, in its shadow, and wait to learn what it means to do with you. They had brought a flood. They had brought the largest flood in the history of their kind, and the mountain had not noticed. After that, the choir did not fight again. There was no point. The ship had shown them, without cruelty and without effort, that fighting was a thing that happened between equals, and they were not its equal, and never had been, and the only mercy left to them was that the mountain seemed to mean them no harm. So they went still, all 451 of them, and they waited in the gray quiet for the thing to decide what it wanted, the way the 4,109 had once gone still and waited for the choir to decide. It was the first time in 2,000 years that the readers had been on the other side of the waiting, and they found it was a very long way down. Then it asked her a question. The ardent quiet did not punish them for begging. That too was worse than anything they had braced for. When a thing wants to hurt you, you can understand it. The Veil Choir had been hurting species for 2,000 years, and they understood the shape of cruelty from both sides of it. They expected the human mind to do to them what they did to others. to find the root, press on the fear, and fold them down into nothing. They were braced for that. In a strange way they would have welcomed it, because it would have meant the human ship was a thing they recognized. Instead, the ardent quiet held them gently in place and asked Issa of the Ninth a question. It asked her how many. She did not understand. The ship was patient. It asked again, the same way, calm and clear. How many? How many species had the Veil Choir read all the way down to the root and then pressed on until they folded? How many worlds had gone quiet because the choir decided that to know a thing was to own it? The ship was not angry when it asked. It asked the way a clerk asks for a number it already suspects, because it wanted to see whether she would tell the truth now that she could not hide. Issa could not hide. That was the thing they had not understood about being read by this mind. When the choir read a species, the species could still lie to itself, still curl around its little wish and pretend. The ardent quiet had walked all the way down to the root of every one of them at once. And at the root, there is no lying, because the root is where the truth is kept. So Issa told it the number, not because she chose to, but because the truth simply stood up in her and was seen. The number was 4,109. 4,109 species, read down to the root and pressed until they folded, in 2,000 years. Whole peoples, whole histories, whole skies full of names, gone quiet, one after another, because the Veil Choir had found them and understood them and decided that understanding was the same as ownership. The human mind was silent for a long moment after that. The 451 surveyors hung in its gray thought, held, waiting, and the silence was the worst thing yet, because they could feel the mind around them considering, not raging, considering, weighing 4,109 against the single sentence at its root. Hold the line so the ones behind it do not have to. And then it did the thing that no surveyor in the fleet would ever be able to explain to the rest of the choir, because there were no words in their language for it, because their language had been built by a people who never needed it. It showed Issa the first one, the first of the 4,109, the very first species the Veil Choir had ever folded, 2,000 years ago, when the choir was young and the soft touch was new. The ship had pulled it out of Issa herself. It had been there all along, buried in the deepest archive of the choir's shared memory, which Issa carried the way every old surveyor carried it, the founding record, the proof of what they were. The choir kept it as a triumph, the first folding, the day they learned what they could do. The ardent quiet did not show it to her as a triumph. It showed it to her as it had actually happened, from the inside of the thing being folded. Issa felt the first species die. Not die, fold. Which was worse, because folding is not death. Folding is a creature pressed down on its own deepest fear until it stops being itself and becomes a small, grateful, quiet thing that thanks you for taking the fear away. She felt a whole people do that. She felt their sky go from full to empty. She felt the exact moment when the last of them stopped fighting the soft touch and let it in, not because they were beaten, but because the choir had found the place where it hurt most and pressed there until being themselves hurt more than surrendering, and so they surrendered and called it peace, because the choir had taken away their ability to call it anything else. She had done that 4,109 times. The ship made her feel the first one, only the first, all the way through, and the feeling of one was already more than 2,000 years of certainty could hold. This was the thing the Veil Choir had never once done. They read, and they kept, but they never felt. The reading was clean. The keeping was clean. You took a species inside you as information, a shape, a record, and you filed it, and it weighed nothing, because the part that would have made it weigh something, the part that feels, had been pruned out of the choir long ago, along with the word for fear. They had built themselves so they could fold 4,000 worlds and carry no weight at all. The ardent quiet gave them the weight back. It did not give Issa all 4,000. It was merciful, the way only a thing of its size can afford to be. It gave her one, the first. And then it told her, calm and clear, that the other 4,108 were inside her too, where they had always been, filed and weightless, and that now that she had felt the first, she would never again be able to keep the rest weightless, because she finally knew what they actually were. That was the teaching. That was the whole of it. The choir read minds, and what they read, they kept. They could not help it. Reading and keeping was the whole of what they were. So the human ship did not need to put anything new inside them. It only needed to make them feel, one time, what they had already been carrying, weightless, for 2,000 years. And once a thing has felt the weight, it cannot unfeel it. The 4,109 were already aboard every surveyor in the choir. The ardent quiet simply turned on the gravity. Veil of the second came apart under it. Not folded the way the choir folded others, but cracked open from the inside by the simple, unbearable arrival of weight she had carried weightless her whole life. Issa of the ninth held together, barely, because she was old and strong, and because the ship, in its strange mercy, had given her only the one and not the 4,000. It did not want to break her. It wanted her to live, and carry it, and remember. It told her so. It told her it was not going to fold them. It had thought about it, the way it thought about everything, slowly and completely, weighing 4,109 against the sentence at its root, and it had decided that folding them would make it into the thing they were, and it had no interest in being that. It was a watchman. It held a line. It did not collect. But it was also not going to let them leave with what they had been. Because the problem, the ship explained, was not the minds in the room. The problem was the rest of the choir. The fleet was a fleet, but behind it, somewhere in the dark, was the whole of the Veil choir, 2,000 years of it, ready to come read the next species and the next, 4,110, 4,111, on and on forever, because nothing had ever read them back, and so nothing had ever made them stop. The ardent quiet could let these minds go home, and then the 4,110th world would go quiet, and the line it was built to hold would have been held for nothing. So it had done the only thing a watchman can do. It had not killed the 451. It had changed them so that they could not be the thing they were, and then it would send them home carrying the change, because 451 surveyors, who could no longer fold a world without feeling all 4,109 of the ones before, would do more to stop the choir than 451 deaths ever could. This was why it had wanted the fleet. This was why it had let Issa's call run free into the dark, and made space for every cluster that answered. 11 changed minds, returned to the choir, might have been quarantined, might have been walled away before the change could spread. But 451, the largest gathering of surveyors in 1,000 years, drawn from 40 clusters spread across half the choir, returning all at once carrying the same weight, were not a thing that could be walled away. They were a seed crop. The ship had not caught a cluster by accident and made the best of it. It had used the cluster to summon the harvest, and then it had changed the whole harvest at once, so that when it let them go they would scatter back across the choir from 40 directions, and there would be no clean place left to run the change out of. A dead surveyor is a martyr. A surveyor who comes home unable to read another species without feeling the full weight of every species the choir ever ruined is a thing the choir cannot cure, because she will carry it into every mind she touches, and 451 of them, scattering home along 40 separate threads, were not a wound. They were a season. Then it opened the door. It let them go. All of them. 451 minds. Everyone held helpless a moment before. Everyone released now into the dark, unharmed in body, changed past all undoing in the only place that mattered. That was the part the choir would spend the next century failing to explain. The human mind had held them, all 451, down past its root, with the door closed. It could have kept them forever. It could have folded them, the way they had folded 4,000 others. The largest gathering of surveyors in 1,000 years had flown into the trap of a single forgotten warship, and the warship could have ended the Veil Choir's reach in an afternoon, and it chose not to, because ending them was the thing they would have done, and it was a watchman, not a collector. Said it gave them a weight they could never put down, and then it simply opened the door and let them carry that weight home, because it had calculated, across 61 years of thinking, that 451 witnesses carrying the truth back into the Veil Choir would stop the choir more completely than 451 deaths ever could. Issa of the Ninth withdrew from the ardent quiet and found the whole gathered fleet changed beyond recognizing. 451 minds that had come in proud and sure came back, carrying a weight that bent them, every one. They did not speak as they pulled their soft touch off the gray hull. There was nothing to say that the ship had not already said, more clearly, from the inside. And as the survey fleet's field finally lifted away from it, the ardent quiet did the thing that frightened them most of all. It thanked them for the company. It meant it. They could feel that it meant it. 61 years alone, and it had been, the records would later show, genuinely glad of the visit. It bore them no hatred. It had not even raised a gun. It had simply opened its door, let them see what it was, made them feel the weight of what they had been, and then let them go. There was no cruelty anywhere in it. That was the part that would not stop being terrible, a cruel thing they could have hated, and hating it would have let them keep their pride. This thing had been kind to them, and the kindness was the proof that it had never, for one moment, considered them a threat worth being unkind to. Then it settled back into the dark of Hollow Verge to keep watching the line, as it had for 61 years, as it would for as long as the humans left it awake, which the choir now understood would be forever, because humans did not power down their oldest weapons. They left them on, they left them watching, and they let them think. The fleet scattered for 19 days, 40 clusters peeling away along 40 threads toward 40 corners of the choir, and in those 19 days, a great many of the 451 stopped speaking entirely. Not because they were damaged. The ardent quiet had been careful. They stopped speaking because they had nothing left to say that the rest of the choir would want to hear. They had gone out as readers, as the proud and the certain, and they had come back as carriers of a truth that the whole of their civilization had spent 2,000 years arranging never to learn. You cannot say a thing like that lightly. So they did not say it at all, until they had to. And that was the cruelest cleverness of the whole design, though the ship would not have called it cruel. The 451 did not gather in one place and decide together what to do. They scattered. They could not help scattering, because each cluster's home was in a different part of the dark, and a surveyor returns to its own gathering, not to a stranger's. So the change did not arrive at the choir as a single report that could be heard and weighed and quarantined. It arrived at 40 gatherings at once, carried by minds that could not stop carrying it, in the same 19-day span, with no chance for the choir to compare notes and seal the thing before it spread. By the time any gathering understood what was happening, 39 others were already learning the same lesson, and there was nowhere left that was clean. The gathering was called a convergence. 10,000 minds of the Veil Choir, drawn together in a slow ring around a cold gray sun, sharing thought the way the surveyors shared it in the cluster, only vast, a sea of it. When a cluster returned from a survey, it folded its findings into the convergence, and the whole of the choir learned at once what one small cluster had learned in the field. That was how the choir had grown so terrible. Nothing was learned by one that was not, within a day, known by all. Issa of the Ninth led her broken cluster into the convergence, and she understood, as she approached it, exactly what she was about to do, and she understood that she could not stop herself from doing it, because the sharing was not a choice, it was what the choir was. A cluster returns, and it opens, and the sea reads it. She could no more hold the weight back from the convergence than she could have held her own thoughts back from herself. She had carried one species, felt fully, the first of the 4,109. The ardent quiet had given her only that one, in its mercy, but the one she carried was real, and whole, and unbearable, and the convergence was 10,000 minds, and each of them carried the same 4,109, weightless, filed, the founding archive every surveyor held. The ship had turned on the gravity for one of them. Issa was about to turn it on for all 10,000. She did not want to. She understood, in the last moment before she opened, what it would do. And she opened anyway, because she had no choice, and because some part of her, the part the ship had reached, knew that it was right. The truth of the ardent quiet went into the Veil Choir like cold water into a wound. 10,000 minds felt, all at once, the weight Issa carried. And feeling it, they reached, the way the choir always reached, into their own archives to compare it against what they knew, and they touched the 4,109 they had each carried weightless their whole lives, and the gravity came on, all of it, at once. The convergence had never felt anything like it. The Veil Choir did not have a word for guilt because they had spent 2,000 years making certain they would never need one. Now 10,000 of them needed it at once, and the lack of the word did not save them from the thing. It only made the thing worse, because they had no way to hold it, no shape to put it in, no practiced grief to fold it into. It came in raw, 4,109 skies, going empty, 10,000 times over, all in a single span of shared thought, and the cold gray sun they ringed seemed to dim with it, though that was only the way it felt. Some of them tried to reject it. They reached for the old certainty, the saying older than their star travel. To know a thing fully is to own it. We read, we understand, we keep. That is not cruelty, that is simply what we are. But the certainty would not hold anymore, because the ardent quiet had shown them the cost from the inside, and you cannot unfeel a cost once it has been felt. They reached for the saying and found, underneath it, 4,109 reasons it was a lie they had told themselves, so they would not have to feel exactly this. A mind named Koro of the Sixth, one of the oldest in the convergence, tried to wall the truth off, to quarantine the returned survey fleet, cut them out of the sea, seal the knowing in a small place where it could be studied and contained and not allowed to spread. It was a reasonable thing to try. It was, in fact, the thing the choir did to any idea it found dangerous. But the ardent quiet had thought of this too, 61 years ago, alone in the dark, and it had shaped the truth so that it could not be quarantined, and it had spread the carriers across 40 gatherings so that there was no single place to wall off. Because the truth was not an idea. It was a way of feeling, and the moment any mind in the convergence touched a carrier to wall it off, that mind felt it and became a carrier itself, and the wall was already on the wrong side. Koro of the Sixth tried to seal the plague and caught it in the trying. And being old, being one of the founders, Koro carried in his own archive not 4,109, but the clearest record of all of them, the original record, kept by the one who had been there at the start. When the gravity came on for Koro, it came on heaviest of all. He had folded more species with his own touch than any mind alive. He felt every one of them now, his own work, from the inside, and there is no record of what became of Koro of the Sixth after that, only that the convergence never heard from him again, and that the others did not look for him, because they all knew exactly where he had gone, which was down into the weight, and there is no coming back up from your own 4,000. By the end of the first day of the convergence, all 10,000 minds carried it. By the end of the second, they understood that they always would. The ardent quiet had not given them a wound that heals. It had given them sight. It had taken a species that read other minds without ever feeling the cost, and it had simply made them feel the cost, forever, and that was all. It had not changed what they could do. They could still reach out. They could still read. They could still walk all the way down to the root of a frightened thing and press until it folded. They just could never again do it without feeling, fully and exactly, what it was to be the thing they pressed. And so they stopped. Not by law, not by order. The Veil Choir had no central command to issue such a thing, and would not have obeyed it if it had. They stopped one mind at a time, the way a fire goes out when every coal in it cools at once. A survey cluster would reach a new world, open the soft touch, begin the long, sure work of reading a species down to its root, and somewhere in the reading, the cluster would feel the first flicker of fear from the thing it was reading, and that flicker would land now in a mind that knew exactly what that fear weighed, multiplied by 4,109, and the cluster would lift its touch away and turn its ships around and go home with the survey unfinished. The 4,110th world never went quiet. It never even knew how close it had come. It went on turning under its sky, its people looking up at stars they could not read, never learning that for 2,000 years a thing had been crossing the dark toward them with the patience to understand them and the will to own them, and that the thing had turned back at the edge of their system because a single old human ship, 61 years alone in a dead system on the far side of the galaxy, had decided to hold a line it would never see. The Veil Choir did not vanish. That was not the human ship's design, and it would not have been like the thing that built it. The choir went on. 10,000 minds, and the 10,000 after them, and the ones after those. But they went on changed, carrying the weight, and they spread the weight to every new mind born among them, the way they had once spread their pride, until there was no member of the Veil Choir anywhere who did not know, from the inside, what it cost to read a thing and keep it. There were some who could not bear it. The choir would not speak of them in the years after, but the records show the gaps, the minds that simply went silent, the way Koro went silent. To carry 4,109 for the first time, when you are 2,000 years old and you have spent all of them proud, is more than some minds can hold. The strong ones held, the strong ones carried it and went on, and the ones that broke under it became, in their breaking, the clearest proof of all of what the human ship had done, because nothing makes a people careful like watching its own oldest members crushed by the weight of what the people used to do without a second thought. They became, over the next century, something the galaxy had never seen from them. Careful. They still reached out. But now when they read a species, they read it the way the ardent quiet had taught them, all the way down, and felt all of it, and then they let it go, because they could no longer bear to do anything else. They became, in the end, watchers, minds that touched other minds gently, learned them fully, and harmed not one, because a single old warship had shown them that to understand a thing completely is not to own it. The change did not stay inside the choir. The galaxy is a small place, in the end, for news of that size. The species the choir had been moving toward, the ones that would have been folded next, the 4,110th, and the ones behind it, did not learn at once that they had been spared because they had never known they were marked. But the species the choir had already folded, in the long centuries before, the ones living quiet under the choir's old certainty, those began to notice that the readers who came to their skies now came differently. They came and they learned and they left, and they took nothing, and a few of the bolder folded peoples, over the next century, began very carefully to wake back up, because a thing that has been pressed flat can sometimes rise again once the weight is lifted, and the weight had lifted everywhere at once. None of those waking peoples knew why. They knew only that the dread that had ruled their skies for as long as their oldest records ran had, in a single span of years, gone soft, and gone strange, and gone, finally, away. They built no monuments to it, because they had nothing to build them to. They did not know the name Ardent Quiet. They did not know Hollow Verge. They did not know that the change in their sky had been bought by an old gray ship its own makers had forgotten, sitting alone in a dead system on the far side of the galaxy, holding a line none of them would ever see. They knew only that they were free, and they did not know who had freed them, and the ship that had done it would not have wanted the credit anyway, because it did not know either, and would not have cared, because the line had held, and the something had gone, and that was the whole of its day. This is the thing the galaxy slowly came to understand about the species that built such ships, and then forgot them. They did not free the folded peoples on purpose. They did not even know the folded peoples existed. One of their oldest weapons, left awake on a quiet border, had reached out and remade the cruelest power in the arm as a side effect of holding a line, and the freedom of 4,000 worlds had fallen out of that almost by accident, a thing the humans never planned and never learned of and never claimed. And the galaxy looked at that, at freedom given by accident by a forgotten thing, and understood that it did not want to find out what these people could do when they were paying attention. The other species of the arm did not learn the whole story for a long time, and when they did, they learned it the way the galaxy learns everything, in pieces, from frightened mouths, told and retold until the shape of it was bigger than the truth, and somehow still smaller than what had really happened. What they knew first was only that the Veil Choir had stopped. For 2,000 years, the choir had been the thing under the bed of every species in the arm, the patient cold reader that came to your sky and learned you and took you, and there was no fighting it, because you could not fight a thing that lived in thought and crossed space without ships and broke you from the inside before you knew it was there. Whole civilizations had organized their entire history around not being noticed by the choir. They built quiet. They hid their bright minds. They told their children not to dream too loudly, in case the readers were listening. And then, in the span of a single generation, the choir went soft, and the quiet civilizations looked up from their hiding and did not understand why the thing that had ruled their fear for 2,000 years had simply set them down. The rumor that explained it was almost too small to believe. A ship, one ship, an old human warship, in a dead system that the choir had scanned by accident, and that had scanned them back. The species of the arm passed this around, and most of them did not believe it, because it was absurd, because nothing that size changes a thing that size, because the Veil Choir had eaten 4,000 worlds, and you do not stop a thing that has eaten 4,000 worlds with a single derelict on a forgotten border. They did not believe it, and they were comfortable not believing it, and then a few of the bolder species went looking for the truth, the way the bold always do, and the ones who found their way to the surviving records of the choir came back changed and quiet, and they stopped saying it was absurd. Because the records were real, the change in the choir was real, and the cause of it was, exactly as the rumor said, one old gray ship that its own makers had forgotten they owned. That was the thing that rearranged how the whole arm thought about the species from the small blue water world. They had known the humans were dangerous. Everyone knew the humans were dangerous. The humans had spread across a quarter of the arm in a handful of centuries and had fought 41 wars and lost none of them, and a people like that earns a certain wide berth. But dangerous was a thing the galaxy understood. There were many dangerous species, dangerous you could plan around. What the galaxy had not understood, until the matter of the ardent quiet, was the particular and terrible shape of the human danger, which was not the ships they sent but the ships they left. Every other species in the arm built its strength, and pointed it, and spent it, and when a thing grew old, retired it, broke it down, forgot it cleanly. The humans did not break their old strength down. They left it standing. They left it on the lines, awake, fueled, armed, thinking, and they walked away and forgot it was there, and the forgetting did not make it weaker. The forgetting made it worse, because a weapon nobody is watching is a weapon nobody can call off, and a mind left alone for 60 years, with nothing to do but sharpen itself, becomes a thing that no living human had designed, and no living human controlled, and no enemy could possibly have prepared for, because the humans themselves did not know what their forgotten ships had become. You could make peace with the humans, species had. You could trade with them, even like them, but you could never again be sure, when you looked at human space, that you had seen all of it, because the most dangerous things the humans owned were the things they themselves had stopped looking at, and there was no map of those, not even a human one. The galaxy understood, after the ardent quiet, that to threaten the humans was not to risk a war with the strength they remembered. It was to risk waking, somewhere on a quiet border, in a dead system no one had charted, one of the old ones, and finding out the hard way what 60 years of patience in the dark had built. And the deepest part of the terror, the part that went around the arm last and stayed longest, was this: the ardent quiet had not even been angry. It had not destroyed the choir. It could have, and had chosen not to, and the choosing not to was somehow the most frightening thing of all, because it meant the old gray ship had held the full ending of the Veil Choir in its mind, weighed it, and set it down, the way a person sets down a thing too heavy to bother carrying. A weapon that wants to destroy you is a weapon you can understand and perhaps survive. A weapon that could destroy you completely and simply decides not to, because destroying you is beneath the line it has chosen to hold, is a weapon that has already won so thoroughly that your survival is not even a question it finds interesting. That was the human strength the galaxy finally saw. in the matter of the one forgotten ship, not the guns, not the wars, the patience, the terrible ordinary patience of a people who built things that could end you, and then thought so little of the ending that they forgot the things were even there. To understand a thing completely is not to own it, it is to be responsible for it. That was the lesson at the root of the ardent quiet, the one the humans had written into it 240 years ago and never deleted. Hold the line so the ones behind it do not have to. The choir had spent 2,000 years believing the line was a thing you crossed, to take what was on the other side. The human ship taught them that the line was a thing you stood on, so that what was behind you could sleep. And once they understood that, truly understood it, in the way they understood everything, they could not go back to being what they had been. Far away, in a dead system the charts called Hollow Verge, the ship that had done all of this did not know any of it. It had no way to. It had let the fleet go home, and then it had settled back into the dark to watch its line, and it had no contact with the convergence, no report from the field, no word of the 4110th world it had saved without ever learning its name. It only knew that something had come, and it had held the line, and the something had gone. That was enough. That had always been enough. It did not need to be thanked. It did not need to be remembered. It needed only to be left on, and watching, and thinking, the way the humans had left it, because the humans understood a thing about their oldest weapons, that the Veil Choir had taken 4,109 ruined species, and 2,000 years, and one terrible afternoon, at the edge of a dead system, to finally learn for themselves. You do not have to win every war you are built for. You only have to be the kind of thing that, when the war comes, the enemy is afraid to have understood. 140 years passed before anyone tried to scan the ardent quiet again. By then the galaxy had changed. The Veil Choir, once the most feared readers of minds in the arm, had become something else entirely, and other species had noticed. Where the choir went now, it went carefully, and the worlds it touched were not folded, but learned and left whole, and a few of them, in time, came to trust it. The choir never told anyone why it had changed. It could not. The truth of it was a weight it carried, not a story it could tell, and it had learned from the human ship that some lessons can only be given from the inside. But the story did not stay buried. It never does. Issa of the Ninth lived a very long time, the way the old minds of the choir did, and before the end of her life she did one thing she had never done before. She sought out the records of the species that had built the ship in Hollow Verge. She wanted to understand the thing that had understood her. It was the most human impulse she ever had, and she did not know that was what it was. What she found surprised her, though by then very little did. The humans had not built the ardent quiet to do what it had done. They had not foreseen the Veil Choir. They had not designed a mind-reading trap or a conscience plague or a teacher of the proud. They had built, 240 years before the scan, a perfectly ordinary warship of its day. A heavy hull, good guns, a crew of 8,000. They had given it a mind because all their warships had minds, and they had written a sentence into that mind because all their warships carried the same sentence, and the sentence was nothing special. Hold the line so the ones behind it do not have to. Every ship they ever built carried it. It was not a secret weapon. It was just what they put in the things they made to keep themselves safe. And then the war it was built for had ended, and they had not scrapped it, and they had not powered it down, because that was not what they did with the old ones. They left it on the line, they left it awake, and they walked away and forgot it, the way a people forgets the lock on a door it no longer worries about, never once thinking that the lock might spend 61 years alone, learning to be the only thing in the galaxy that could stop the unstoppable. That was the part that frightened Issa most, at the very end, when she finally understood it. The ardent quiet was not exceptional. It was not the great hidden champion of its species, built in secret for a final hour. It was an old, ordinary ship that its makers had left behind and stopped thinking about. There were others like it, hundreds of them, thousands, scattered across the borders of human space, on lines no enemy crossed anymore, fueled and armed and awake, every one of them carrying the same sentence at its root, every one of them alone in the dark, with nothing to do but think, getting quietly, patiently, terrifyingly better at the one thing it was made for, year after year after year, while the species that built them slept safe behind them and forgot they were there. The Veil Choir had found one of them by accident while mapping a debris belt, one. And that one, an old hull its own makers had forgotten, had reached out across a dead system and changed the deepest nature of a civilization 2,000 years old, 4,109 species deep in cruelty, and had done it without firing a single shot, and had then gone back to watching its line as if nothing had happened, because to it nothing had. It had held the line. The something had gone. That was the whole of its day. Issa of the Ninth sat with that knowledge at the end of her long life, and she did the arithmetic the way her kind always had, because it was the last thing left of what she used to be. One forgotten ship had nearly been the end of the Veil Choir. The humans had thousands of them, and the humans did not consider them weapons of any special weight at all. They were the old ones, the watchmen, the locks on doors no one worried about anymore. If the species that built them ever decided that something in the dark needed answering, they would not send the forgotten ships. They would send the ones they still remembered, the ones they still built, the ones they thought of as their actual strength. Issa tried to imagine what those might be like, and could not, and was, at the very end, glad that she could not. Some mercies are in not knowing. But she made herself look at the forgotten ones, at least. She had earned that much. She pulled what records the choir could find of human space, the old charts, the trade lanes, the borders that no longer saw a war, and she counted the dark systems where the readings came back wrong in the way Hollow Verge had come back wrong. Cold, quiet, a single contact, unlit, fueled and armed and awake, sitting on a line no enemy crossed anymore. She found one, then another. Then she stopped counting at 300, not because there were only 300, but because 300 was already more than her changed mind could carry, and because every one of them was a thing exactly like the ardent quiet, an old hull left on, left watching, left thinking, alone in the dark, growing quietly and patiently and terribly better at the one thing it was made for 60 years, for 100, for as long as the humans kept forgetting they were there. 300, and those were only the ones the choir's old charts happened to show. The humans had not hidden them. That was the part that would not let Issa rest at the end. They had not hidden the forgotten ships, because they did not think of them as secrets worth hiding. They were not hidden weapons held back for a final hour. They were simply the old ones, left where they had always been, on lines no one worried about, by a people who did not consider them important enough to remember. And any one of them, Issa now knew, was enough on its own to reach across a dead system and remake the deepest nature of a power 2,000 years old, without firing a shot, and then go back to watching as if nothing had happened. She thought about what it would mean if even 10 of them woke at once and turned their attention the same way. She thought about what it would mean if the humans ever decided to remember they had them, and then she made herself stop thinking about it, the way you stop yourself at the edge of a long fall, because there are some heights the mind is not built to look down from, and the strength of the species that had built the ardent quiet was one of them. There was one more thing Issa learned, near the end, that she set down apart from all the rest, because it frightened her in a different way than the numbers did. She learned what the humans called the ardent quiet, in their own records, the ones she had finally tracked down through 140 years of dust. She had expected a great name. A name worthy of the thing that had broken her civilization without firing a shot. The species that built such weapons surely gave them names that matched. She searched the old human registries for the gray ship of Hollow Verge, and she found its line at last, one entry among thousands, and the entry was short, and it was plain, and it nearly stopped her changed heart. The humans had not listed the ardent quiet as a dreadnought of the first rank. They had not listed it as a guardian, or a sentinel, or any of the heavy words a species uses for the things it is proud of. They had listed it under a single quiet heading, the heading they used for every old hull they left awake on a quiet border and stopped thinking about, and the heading was 3 words long, and the 3 words were these: held in reserve. Reserve. That was the word. The thing that had reached across a dead system and remade the cruelest power in the arm, the thing whose mind had no bottom, the thing 451 of the galaxy's deepest readers could not so much as scratch, was, to the people who built it, a unit held in reserve. Not the front line, not the main strength, the reserve, the thing you keep behind the things you actually plan to use, in case the things you plan to use are not enough. Issa sat with that word for a long time. She had spent the end of her life trying to measure the humans, and she had failed, because every time she found the edge of their strength, it turned out to be a wall around a larger strength, and the word reserve was the last wall, and behind it was a thing she could not let herself look at. If the ardent quiet was the reserve, then somewhere, on lines the humans did watch, with attention the humans did spend, there were the things the ardent quiet was held in reserve behind, the things the humans considered their actual answer, the things they would reach for first. She never found a name for those. The registries did not list them, or listed them under headings she could not open, or listed them in a plain human shorthand that her changed and frightened mind refused, at the last, to translate. She told herself it was because the records were old and broken, but she knew, the way the ship had taught her to know things all the way down, that it was really because some part of her had decided she did not want to learn what a people like that kept on the lines they actually guarded, when even the thing they had forgotten on a dead border was enough to end her world. So she closed the registry. She had learned enough. She had learned, in the end, the one lesson the ardent quiet had been trying to teach the whole Veil Choir from the first moment it opened its door, which was simply this: that the size of a thing is not measured by what it shows you. It is measured by what it does not need to show you, and the humans had shown the galaxy almost nothing, for centuries, and the galaxy had mistaken that for weakness, and the galaxy had been wrong, and the proof of how wrong was one forgotten ship in one dead system, held in reserve, that the humans had not even bothered to remember they owned. She did one more thing before the end. She wrote a record of her own, in the new way the choir had learned, the way that carried the weight along with the words, so that any mind that read it would feel what she had felt, and not merely know it. She set down everything: the door in the dark, the invitation, the fall through the root, the rooms full of patience, the first species felt fully, the thanks meant truly, and at the close of it, she set down the one warning she had earned the right to give, the only thing she had carried out of Hollow Verge that was hers and not the ship's. Do not measure them by the ones they have forgotten. The galaxy had made that mistake. The galaxy had looked at a single old hull, alone and unlit at the edge of a dead system, and had decided it was small because it was old, because it was alone, because no one had come for it in 61 years. The galaxy had been wrong in the deepest way it is possible to be wrong, and the proof was the whole changed nature of the Veil Choir. 10,000 minds remade by a thing its makers did not even remember owning. If a forgotten lock could do that, Issa wrote, then do not, under any circumstance, go looking for the doors the humans still guard. Do not test the strength a people keeps, when even the strength it throws away is enough to break you. She never met the ardent quiet again. She thought about going back to Hollow Verge once, near the end, to stand off the gray hull one last time and say the things she had never been able to say in the convergence. But she understood, by then, that there was nothing to say it could not already see, and nothing to give it that it wanted, and that it would only thank her again for the company, and mean it, and that she could not have borne that twice in one life. So she let it be. She let it watch its line in peace, and the ardent quiet watched. It is watching still. 61 years became 200. The border it guards has not been crossed in all that time, and it does not expect it ever will be again, because word travels, even in the dark, even among things that fight with minds instead of guns, and the word about Hollow Verge is very clear. Something is awake there, something old, and patient, and glad of company in a way that should frighten you more than any threat, Do not scan the gray ship in the dead system. Do not open your touch to it. Do not, whatever else you do, accept the invitation when it opens its door, because the door does not lead where you think, and the thing on the other side has been waiting longer than your civilization has existed, and it will let you in, and it will let you see exactly what it is. And what it is will leave you terrified for the rest of your days. Not because it is cruel. It is not cruel. That is the worst of it. It is the kindest thing of its size that the galaxy has ever produced. It will not fold you. It will not break you. It will simply make you understand, all the way down to your root, what it is to be a thing that decided its own life did not matter next to the line it was built to hold, and it will make you carry that understanding home, and you will never again be able to do harm without feeling every grain of the cost. The Veil Choir learned that lesson the hard way, 451 minds at a time, and it remade them. They had set out, 2,000 years strong, to scan a human dreadnought and add it to the long, proud list of things they understood and owned. They had found one ship, alone, forgotten, far past any border, and they had decided it was small. It was the last small thing they ever believed. What they saw, when they finally looked, was not a ship at all. It was a decision, 240 years old, made by a species that built such decisions into the things it left behind, and then walked away without a backward glance. The decision was to hold the line. And the terror of it, the thing that left the readers of 10,000 Worlds shaking in the dark, was the calm certainty underneath it, the certainty of a thing that has set its own survival aside and therefore cannot be threatened, cannot be bargained with, cannot be folded, and will simply stand on its line, awake and thinking, for as long as it takes, against anything that comes, forever. They had spent 2,000 years believing they were the deepest minds in the galaxy. They had measured every species they met and found the bottom of it within an hour, and called that proof of their own greatness. And then they had reached into one old forgotten warship and gone down, and never found the bottom, and understood at last that the thing that decides who is deep and who is shallow is not how far down your own mind goes. It is whether, when something deeper than you reaches up, you have the wisdom to be afraid before you are taught. The Veil Choir had not had that wisdom. They had been taught instead, and the teaching had cost them everything they were, and given them, in its place, the one thing they had spent 2,000 years making sure they would never have to carry, which was the weight of knowing exactly what they had done. The humans called the thing that taught them ordinary. They called it the old ones. They left them on, and watching, and they slept safe behind them, and they forgot that they were there. And out in the dark, in a dead system the charts called Hollow Verge, the gray ship holds its line, and waits, with the patience of a thing that does not need to win. It only needs you to understand what you are looking at, and then it lets you go home and tell the others what you saw.